Hi there, and welcome to Military Histories, a podcast from York Army Museum. Each week we share an interview from the Royal Dragoon Guards audio archive. This season we will be sharing interviews with veterans of the Korean War. You can find more details about the Royal Dragoon Guards Oral History Project in the show notes. If you want to find out a bit more about our museum, there are links to our website and social media channels in the show notes too. In this week's interview you can hear Major General Mike Swindells describe his experiences from national service in 1948, throughout his service with the regiment and his career thereafter. His discussion of his experiences of the Korean War begins at 30 minutes into this interview. Thanks for listening. Future episodes will drop every Friday.
I'm Lieutenant Colonel retired Barry Port, and today I'm interviewing Major General Mike Swindells at his home near Devizes in Wiltshire. The date today is Friday the 15th of November 2013. General, I'd like to start the interview by first of all asking you for your date of birth and a very quick resume of your army service.
I was born on the 15th of January 1930, and my army service started by my call-up at the age of 18, and training initially with the 12th Royal Lancers Training Regiment up at Barnard Castle in County Durham. I passed my War Office Selection Board for National Service Officer Training, and at the now in 1948, I think in December of that year, went down to Mons Officer Cadet School and did the initial general training there, and then went to G Squadron, which was the squadron for training officers destined for Armoured Corps regiments, and passed out from Mons in April 1949. In May 1949, I found myself on a ship from Harwich to the Hook, and on the Red Train, I think it was called, to join the regiment at Barker Barracks, Paderborn. It was an interesting time to join. I was only 19, looked about 16, people said. We had the whole of Barker Barracks to ourselves, with the exception of the lower part was occupied by a Polish displaced persons unit wearing blue battle dress who did guard jobs around the area. The town of Paderborn was absolutely flat. It had been bombed heavily by the Americans, and the German population were in a sorry state. There was very little fraternisation. Shall I stop there? As I was only a National Service officer, I did my basic year with the regiment, went out, worked in the cotton industry for a year and a half, and then asked if I might rejoin to go with the regiment to Korea. From Korea, I took a regular commissions board and served with the regiment until through the Staff College, commanding a squadron, staff jobs, commanding a squadron again in Aden, and then took a squadron to Cyprus in 1966, I think, and then was Brigade Major of 7th Armoured Brigade and selected for promotion to Lieutenant Colonel in 1969. Charles Taylor commanded the regiment, and I was lucky enough to be transferred to command the 9th 12th Lancers. And from then on, my career went forward with 2 years in command, time at the Staff College, staff jobs for 2 years, and I rose eventually to the rank of Major General and retired from the army in 1985. The retiring age for those who don't go higher than Major General at the age of 55. That's
Right.
enough.
Well, thank you very much, General. Going back then to the very start of your career, I mean, were there any links within your family to the army?
My father and his 3 brothers had all served in the First World War. We were a North Country family. The elder brother was in the Liverpool Scottish, and the other 3 brothers all in the Royal Artillery. One brother got 2 MCs in the first year of the war in the retreat to Mons. My father was the youngest, and he actually wasn't commissioned until 1918, but then served in the Army of Occupation in the Cologne-Vogelsang area, which I came to know much later. But our family interests were in the cotton industry in Lancashire and Cheshire, and that's why I just did national service and then came out and worked in the mills, learning the business, but I think had the, and I'm not proud of it, it was very obvious, the foresight to see that the cotton industry was doomed for failure, because there was absolutely no need to bring bales of cotton to Lancashire and Cheshire to process when the countries which grew it had the machinery to do the job themselves.
Absolutely. So at that young age, when national service came along, did you think at any stage that you would eventually have a career in the army?
Frankly, I didn't. I mean, at school I was quite keen on the corps and became a sergeant. And the reason I asked to go to the Skins was that they were looking after the Cheshire Yeomanry, and my mother was very friendly with the person who was commanding the Yeomanry at the time and said, you're bound to have to go into the Yeomanry after national service, so why not ask if you can go to the Skins? And indeed, the renowned Colonel Monkey Blacker came and interviewed me at Mons for about 10 minutes, and I was accepted by that short interview. He was doing an important job in London, drove down in a rather smart motor car and saw me for a very short time, and that got me to the 5th Royal Inniskilling Dragoon Guards. When I came out, I was an officer in the Cheshire Yeomanry for 18 months before I went back in, and made many friends there, which led later to my becoming adjutant, the Skins adjutant of the Cheshire Yeomanry in turn.
Looking back to when you initially joined, what are your memories of the training that you went through and also at Mons?
The 12th Lancers were a very smart, tight regiment, and they put us recruits through it, on the square, cross country, driving armoured cars, and they had an excellent, those of us who were lucky enough to pass our War Office Selection Board, a brilliant potential officer wing run by somebody called Robin Brockbank, who'd had a distinguished career in North Africa and Italy with an MC, and a Sergeant Priddy Smith, who was just the kindest, most respected sergeant that anybody could possibly have, looked after us and pushed us through. The training at Mons, the first bit under RSM Britain, was a lot of drill and general map reading and all that sort of stuff. In G Squadron, the armoured corps officers who looked after us were outstanding, and the training was so good that when I got to the regiment, I was way ahead in the skills of a troop leader to my friends who'd come through Sandhurst, who'd had a long session of military history and drill, but didn't know how to speak on a radio or have any of the skills of a troop leader. And it did lead to, rather ridiculously, my greatest friend, David Rurt, was operator in my tank when he got from Sandhurst for about 6 months before he was allowed to command a troop himself.
Before they set him loose, yeah. And would I be right in saying that your instructors at Mons were all ex-wartime people?
Indeed.
Which is where they got their experience from. Yeah. That's excellent. You mentioned earlier in the introduction that you then arrived with the Skins. But was there a period of training in Bovington before then? Did you?
No.
There was no troop leaders course?
Our, as it were, troop leaders training was all done in the G Squadron period, which lasted, I think, about 12 weeks.
Right.
At Aldershot.
Right. So you arrived after an arduous train journey in Paderborn, which you mentioned had been flattened and was probably still flattened at that stage. What are your memories of arriving at the regiment?
Well, I was pretty scared and in awe of our seniors, most of them who'd fought in the Second World War. Colonel Arthur Carr was commanding. Quite a remote person, but a kind person who I came to like enormously later. He, of course, had been in the British Olympic show jumping team in 1948. The stables and riding school were very well kept, and in the stables were a large number of the German 1936 Olympic show jumpers. And so Arthur Carr had taken over from Alec Scott, both in the Olympic team. And Arthur was an extremely able commanding officer on these large German exercises. And he also personally spent a lot of time in the riding school, bringing on younger potential show jumpers in the shape of Guy Wath and Mickey Webber and Peter Lambert, all of whom were on the verge of being in Harry Llewellyn's international show jumping team of the years 49, 50, 51. My squadron leader was John Maud Harrison, an immaculate soldier, had a very good MC, taking C Squadron of the regiment against heavy opposition in the war in the Saltau area of North Germany, where fanatical young Germans gave him a very sticky time, and he commanded with great skill. And I was lucky enough to be a troop leader straight away. The regiment was full of national servicemen. It was half a training regiment. The recruits, the national service recruits, who were of very high calibre. We must remember that in national service, the Royal Armoured Corps got, and probably the gunners, got the cream of the higher IQ soldiers. And we had a very interesting and I think charming lot of young men doing their national service. There were great characters amongst them. In my troop there was a chap who went on to being a professional footballer and played for Liverpool, called Pringle. And I can't remember many of the others. There was one chap who came from near me in Cheshire called Kinsella. And it all fitted in very well. And almost immediately my troop had to do a demonstration with a company of the Rifle Brigade for General Latre de Tassigny, a very senior French, by that time, whether it was NATO general or not, I don't know, but it all went very well, and we had big exercises over the German countryside with no real thought of, well, there was thought about the damage we did, but we were allowed free run over the countryside. And this, of course, went on in Germany for a long time. Right. And I can remember now Colonel Arthur's words over the radio, "Go, go, go like shit off a shovel." Remembering he'd been a pre-war cavalryman, because most of the senior ranks had been on the parade in Colchester, the mechanisation parade, or the farewell to the horses parade, particularly Squadron Sergeant Major Jack Clayton, who went on to be Squadron Sergeant Major of A Squadron in Korea, and other great characters. And there was a lot of wartime experience in the regiment. But we weren't able to actually man 3 proper squadrons then, because C Squadron was a sort of a booster training squadron. The national servicemen came from the training regiments in Catterick or Barnard Castle, Catterick mostly for the tank regiments equipped with Centurion, and they needed further training before they fitted into a troop.
Right. So how many, let's call them Sabre squadrons, did the regiment have at that stage when you arrived?
Well, my recollection is that A Squadron was the only full Sabre squadron, and B and C Squadron was a training squadron, and B was sort of beginning to become a full-blown Sabre squadron.
And did you have a recce troop at the time?
We didn't for a while, and then we did have one armed with Cromwell tanks for a short time. Wow. And Mickey Webber, I can remember him coming into the mess and saying, "Colonel Arthur's asked me to take over recce troop." "Why you?" "I'm the most experienced troop leader," said Mickey. Anyway, we wasn't.
Yeah, but so interesting times, and as you say, large exercises. Now at that time in history, did the regiment or did the army see itself as still an army of occupation, or was there a Soviet threat at that time?
The Berlin airlift was in 1948, so there was very much a Soviet threat, and we were training for that. And can I just stop for a sec?
Certainly. Jeremy, you mentioned the large exercises around the countryside, and unlike today, you had a lot of free rein to just drive around the German countryside, which must have been fantastic. What about the vehicles, the Centurion? Was it a reliable tank?
I believe it was very reliable for its time. I can't remember what mark we had. The 17-pounder was the gun, and it was even then extremely accurate and satisfactory. I can remember getting tanks bogged and the remake getting them out of bogs. I don't think we had very many engine failures, which in view of the fact that when the Chieftain came in, the engines were blowing up all over Germany, is an interesting fact. The Centurion came too late for the Second World War, but in 1949, when I first was lucky enough to be a troop leader and on into Korea, it was the best tank in the world, there's no doubt about that. And the Americans were very envious of us in Korea. The communications, the regiment were hot on this. There were squadron nets where everybody had to be on net, and the competition to not fail when your call sign came up was extreme, and bottles of champagne were levied on any officer who wasn't on call when required to be. B set was less satisfactory, but I think we managed very well for communications with the 19 set.
Right. Away from the exercises, you mentioned the riding school, that sort of thing. What about the rest of the sporting activities within the camp? Was it a sporting regiment? Were there opportunities for the soldiers to play a lot of sports?
Yes, certainly. Sport was encouraged at all levels. Football, as I think I've mentioned, we had one or two ex-professional footballers in the regiment at the time. I can't remember whether we had a success in the Cavalry Cup, but there were successes in BOR competitions. Rugby football was encouraged. Boxing was encouraged, fencing, and there were facilities for those keen on shooting to shoot hares and game. The local Forstmeister had survived his appointment through the war and used to take people out pig shooting on the Teutoburger Wald, the high ridge which separated Paderborn-Sennelager from Detmold and beyond. And I myself was keen on shooting. We got shooting. We would go up to the Elbe to shoot wildfowl, and we were able to fish where we wished. And there were the river that ran into the Mona See was very fruitful. The fish didn't seem to be at all unsuspecting of whatever we chucked at them. But the only time I've been able to capture a number of trout. It was a very good life, and it's almost shaming to say that in the officers' mess we had the number one chef from the Four Seasons Hotel in Hamburg, pre-war, and we had 5-course dinners every night. We had to wear blues, I think, every night of the week, except Wednesdays and the weekends. But we wore blues. There was no mess kit in those at that time, but blues were required. Or you wore a blazer on the other weekend nights, and fairly formal in the mess. Cards were played amongst some of the more senior members and perhaps more daring subalterns. I kept well clear of the card tables. But we were not... I think we had a reputation in the Skins then of being a happy and thoroughly professional cavalry regiment with none of the over-egging the cavalry spirit that was noted in some other regiments who perhaps overdid things a little bit in their officers' mess. And of course in the equestrian world, the Lipspringer horse show was coming into prominence, and the regiment were always up with the leaders in equestrian activities. Right. And amazingly, the Commander-in-Chief of the Rhine Army was General Charles Keighley, Colonel of the regiment, and he, of course, seemed to follow us around as being Commander-in-Chief. We went through Singapore to Korea and found that he was Commander-in-Chief Far East Land Forces, and then we landed up in the Canal Zone, and blow me down, Charles Keighley was Commander-in-Chief Middle East Land Forces. So we were well looked after by the hierarchy in every way.
That's quite handy, isn't it? When you've got. What about social life? Was there a social life outside of the barracks in those days?
There was an officers' club in Lipspringer where all the regiments in the area could go for dinner, and there was dancing on Saturday night. But there was a lack of young female company, and so any dancing was with the wives who were out there, or perhaps some teachers and other people in the area. But these clubs were very well run and everything was extremely cheap. And of course, the talent of the local Germans who had the skills of catering skills was used, and they were very glad to have jobs in such places. Duty-free gin and whiskey were ridiculously cheaply priced. And we've got to remember that back in England, food rationing was very severe. It got worse and worse after the end of the war. And we were living, frankly, the life of Riley. And it went all through ranks. I mean, the soldiers, all ranks, were very well catered for in officers' mess, sergeants' mess. Can't remember whether there's a separate corporal's mess, but the food in the men's mess was very, very good. And people, young men, put on weight noticeably during their national service. Because
that's very interesting. Wow, I mean, you've actually painted the picture there of a very active, professional, and sort of interesting and actually a very nice time in Germany.
I think all ranks enjoyed it.
Right.
And a lot of griping about national service, but every young man who, unless he was exempt for some reason or another, knew that the letter would come through the letterbox when he was 18. School leaving age then was 14, you see, and so a lot of people were doing apprenticeships and the higher grade people, and we benefited from skills that they brought with them into army life. Things like sign writing, you'd need a sign doing. You'd find somebody who'd done an apprenticeship as a sign writer.
Right. So obviously at this stage you were on national service, and clearly that was coming to an end. When did you actually leave the regiment?
I believe in April 1950. And I remember seeing the regiment going off to train at on the ranges at Bergen-Honer, or Belston as we called it then. And I had a fortnight and went off down and stayed by myself skiing in Austria, and then went back home and went into the cotton industry.
What were your thoughts at the time? Were you happy to leave the regiment? Were you looking forward to a new life, or was there some sort of trepidation there about leaving and going back to?
Well, the cotton industry was very much in our family. It's rather embarrassing to say so, that we had been a sort of mill-owning family, and my father, in one of the cotton slumps, we lost our family interest in two large mills in a small town called Bollington near Macclesfield in Cheshire, where the finest yarns were spun because of the damp climate on the edge of the Derbyshire hills. And my father was allowed to continue to manage two mills, which were called George Swindells and Son, and my uncle was a director of the larger conglomerate which owned these mills. And it had always been assumed, I suppose by me, without thinking very much, and my father, that I would follow him into the industry. I said to him, I'm enjoying the army so much, I'd like to stay in. He said, you can't possibly stay in a cavalry regiment and with very little money and enjoy the life that you would like to enjoy, so you better knuckle down and get on with the cotton industry. So I did for nearly 18 months, I think. The Korean War started, of course, in June 1950, and the country was semi-mobilised for this, in that two battalions went straight away from Hong Kong, and a fully equipped brigade was formed and sent out to Korea. And that led to, because the Cold War was at its height, and there was a serious threat from the Soviet Union. National service was increased for 2 years. But for my part, I worked in the mills through the departments, and people were amusing and kind to me and teased me, and there was a great spirit in these mills, but the cotton industry was doomed for failure because clever people in Lancashire had invented the machinery which was then exported to the cotton growing countries and could all be done at home. Why bring bales of cotton from America, Egypt and everywhere else to process in Lancashire and Cheshire? So the industry was doomed, and my uncle and father saw the point. I think they both thought I was pretty balmy asking to go back into the regiment, but there we are. I thoroughly enjoyed my time as a young officer in the Cheshire Yeomanry. I think I can say that because of my training with the regiment, my troop won all the competitions in the yeomanry because the regiment had taught me everything, and there were some of these old yeomen who took to it well, and we were, although we only had a couple of centurions in each drill hall, when we went to camp, we were actually issued with a complete regiment of comets, and a commanding officer had got an MC and been on Monty's personal staff. Second in command had been a squadron leader in the 11th Hussars with an MC, and the 3 squadron leaders, one had a DSO and the other 2 were decorated. So it was actually a very strong team, and they had a lot of fun too.
Right.
The camps were very dangerous things. Trained hard in the day, but drank very hard at night.
Yes, that's always. So with the demise of the cotton industry, and you obviously thought it's time to take a slightly different direction. So that led you back to the
it
regiment,
was the fact that the regiment, and I had kept in touch with my friends. When they warned for Korea, I saw a chance, and in fact rather rang up Colonel Arthur Carr and said, could I come back? And he arranged for it. Oh. This, of course, was a disaster for me financially, because the regiment moved back from Germany to Aldershot, to Talavera Barracks, where we had our leave and our preparation for moving out to Korea. The advance party went first and were a month ahead of us, and then we were in Talavera Barracks. I could show you some pictures here of our final parades and everything else. We might look at. And, of course, while I'd been away, a number of young officers had come from Sandhurst who'd got far more money than they ought to have, and I wasn't being paid at all, and we went up to London nearly every night, and it was a very good thing when I left England and the bank were after me. But
yes.
There was nothing very much to spend money on in Korea.
So the time in UK then, obviously the regiment, how long did the regiment spend in Talavera Barracks? Was it?
I would think about 6 weeks.
6 weeks, right.
Yeah.
Right. And this was
and
purely
I joined there.
Right.
And it was the old cavalry barracks in Aldershot, pretty shambolic accommodation. But of course we had no equipment, it was just a staging place. Right. And we were reinforced there by officers and all ranks from other cavalry armoured corps regiments to make us up to a full-strength regiment at war scales, which of course is very much higher than the peacetime establishment. Right. And we had a first-line reinforcements with us. So that meant when we went up...
So after your 6 weeks in Talavera Barracks in Aldershot, how did the regiment then deploy to Korea?
Well, the advance party to take over the 8th Hussars tank set off, I think, 3 weeks to a month ahead of the main party. The main party entrained at Aldershot early one morning in early October, I think. It may have been late September. And we were seen off on this train by the 14th, 20th Hussars, who turned out, and there was all sorts of thunder flash throwing and champagne bottles, and we went on a very long journey by this train up to Liverpool, where we were seen off by the regimental band, got aboard the Georgic, and also by the Minister of Defence, Gilbert Monckton's father, who was then, I think he was the Viscount Monckton of Brenchley, having received the honour because of the work he did on the abdication of Edward VIII. And off we went. And
sorry, could I Gerald, you say the 1420th King's Hussars turned up to say goodbye and give you a good send-off. Why was that? What was the linkage between the regiment and the 1420th?
They were just stationed in Aldershot.
Ah, right.
That was as simple as that.
Right, okay.
And in our farewell parties, we'd seen quite a number of them. Incidentally, also, while we were in Aldershot, Gavin Murray, Captain Gavin Murray, who'd earned an MC with the 8th Hussars in Korea, met most of the subalterns in the Officers' Club in Aldershot and told us of the battles they'd had when, in the Imjin battle, he was, in fact, the second captain of Sea Squadron, of the 8th Hussars, which distinguished itself in helping the Northumberland Fusiliers and Ulster Rifles to withstand a huge Chinese advance, which was so extreme that at times the Chinamen were swarming over tanks, and the only way to deal with them was to use the secondary armament, the Beezer, from another tank to shoot Chinamen who were trying to break into other Sea Squadron tanks. It was a very ferocious battle. Gavin himself was concussed and wounded and woke up in hospital in Japan. And his tragedy was that he was an active service soldier who'd joined the commandos in 1944 because the regiment was doing nothing in Yorkshire and Northumberland. And of course, he then missed out all the service with the regiment from D+, whenever it was, onwards through to Schleswig-Holstein, because the commandos weren't much used then. Volunteered for Korea, got a very good MC there and was highly regarded, but was terribly sad not to go back to Korea with his own regiment.
Yes, yeah, I can imagine.
A real fighting soldier, Gavin.
So I should imagine that it was fantastic that he was there to talk to the young officers.
Yeah, it was rather daunting too.
I should imagine that there were a few eyebrows raised when he spoke about the horrific incident that they must have gone through with the Hussars. So in a way, you had some idea of what you were going to be getting yourselves into.
Yes, but it's quite interesting. You see, the Imjin battle in which he was involved, where they very nearly broke through the 29 Brigade line, and that British brigade was holding the key route down to the capital Seoul. The peace talks, the Imjin battle was in April 1951. Peace talks started in June, July of that very year.
Of course.
And there was a lot of Americans, of course, were in supreme command in Korea. There was a lot of shuffling position for the outcome of the peace talks. But they had started, and so that left uncertainty in our minds as to whether we were going out to a war or going out to see a situation where the two sides were looking at each other and hostilities had stopped. I suppose us young ones, in a way, who looked to our seniors who had seen action, rather hoped in our inner minds that perhaps it would still be going on. A lot of the older ones who got married and were having their first child and all, they thought it would be a very good idea if the peace talks were concluded as soon as possible. It was an interesting time as we sailed out in the Georgic with this uncertainty as to the future. But of course, as we neared the coasts of Korea, Operation Commando took place, in which the 8th Hussars were heavily involved, and this was an attempt by the British Commonwealth Division. By that time, the Commonwealth Division had been formed with Australian and Canadian infantry, New Zealand gunners, Indian field ambulance, and obviously the British 28 and 29 brigades, to capture vital ground which, when a demarcation line was finally set, if the peace talks were successful, would be the line into the future.
Right.
And it was desired. General Castles and the Americans wanted to seize certain high features, principally around the hill we knew as 355, Kawang Song, and another one further on, which Operation Commando failed to capture. And so a large battle was going on involving the whole of the division whilst we were on the Georgic.
Right. But whilst you were sailing out, were you able to get updates from the situation in Korea whilst you were?
Yeah, we had.
On
No, I don't think we had any special updates, but we had the BBC
yes.
service, right. And we stopped at Port Said, Aden, Colombo, and now Sri Lanka, and in Singapore, where we feted by General Keatley and all given great lunch parties and so on by him, and on to Hong Kong, and then on the final spell where the weather got worse and winter began to set in, until we landed at Busan, greeted as always by an American Oompa Poompa black band, and saw the dismal sight of Busan, a wrecked village full of starving Chinese and a lot of Americans as the base.
Wow.
Then we got on a train and we were on it for 2 days, sort of cooking compo rations on such heaters as we could find, and landed at the forward base railhead at Uijeongbu, where that picture of Charles Taylor was taken.
Right. So what was that a bit of a shell shock? I'm assuming that life on board the Georgic was pretty good.
Yeah, it was. We were very well fed, and I'm afraid that we young officers were sort of 4 or 5 to a cabin, squeezed in tight, but we did have a cabin and we were very well fed. The sergeant's mess was equally okay, but we kept in very close touch with our troops, and conditions down below, they weren't hammocks, but they were very tight accommodation and pretty frosty. But we did a lot of PT, and we ran around the decks with our troop at various times, and if you got the 5 o'clock in the morning slot, you were unlucky. But and of course the weather conditions going through the Red Sea, it was pretty unbearable, and a lot of us slept on deck if we were allowed to, and and just took a sleeping bag up there.
So probably in a way it was nice to get off the ship in the end.
We thought that communications wouldn't be very good, and we attempted to learn Morse code. I never took to that very well, but it was quite fun. We had sort of as many sporting competitions as we could, a lot of boxing all throughout the ranks, and we fired I think Bren guns and Brownings off the back of the ship at things we chucked in. You just to keep our eyes in on some weapon training.
Right. So, moving back to the train journey, you mentioned that you got forward to the forward area. What happened there? I take it you took over some tanks, or
we then yes, I mean, I was in A Squadron, and C Squadron were in the line, and so the advance party officers and soldiers of C Squadron were already in their slots in the C Squadron tanks in the line, as we called it. So the those destined for C Squadron were sent up, and the 8th Hussars got out of the tanks, and our chaps got in and went on with such battling as were going on. Our squadron, A Squadron, got into American open back trucks driven by black soldiers, and we motored through a dismal countryside until we got to a re-entrant where there'd obviously been tanks, because the tracks in were all, it was wet and cold then, and muddy. You know what tank tracks are like. We got into this re-entrant where there were a lot of very depressed looking tanks sitting around with what we called hutches behind them, holes in the hill which would sandbag where people lived.
Right, so there you were in this re-entrant, muddy, cold, and you were saying that obviously the vehicles weren't in particularly good nick.
Well, they were well maintained, but they looked pretty battle-worn. And there, lined up in a sort of semi-shambolic parade formation, was our squadron of the 8th Hussars. Why our squadron? Because they had a tradition, being an Irish regiment, that Irishmen can't say A, so it was our squadron. And they were commanded by Major Pat de Clermont, and we were commanded by Major Gilbert Monckton. And they'd been at school together at Harrow and were old friends. So what happened was that we got off the trucks and formed up. And remember, they'd been in this quite tough battle of Op Commando only a month before, had lost people and had prisoners taken. And Pat said to Gilbert, "Well, Gilbert, I hope we've given you a clean potato," because after all, our advance party had taken over all the tanks. And then Pat de Clermont said, "Well, men, 1, 2, 3, and they sang "So Long, It's Been Nice to Know You," jumped on the trucks and drove away, leaving us on a cold, wet day, looking rather forlorn. And then we went to our tanks. We were shown by the advance party to our troops, and the accommodation was a sandbag, corrugated iron hole in the hill beside our tank. And as the winter set in, it was I think it was the 6th of December, it got colder and colder, and when the frost came, we had to we were simply maintaining the tanks and having Christmas and learning to live in Korea and going on recce's up to where we would be in the line. But the drill at night was that you had one chap on duty the whole time, and we could all drive the tank to a certain extent. And in your spell, every 2 hours, you got up, you started the tank, you moved it backwards and forwards about 3 or 4 feet, because if the frost got into the tracks, you had a totally static vehicle, and that wouldn't have done in the event of an attack. So it was quite hard as the winter set in. Now we had our Christmas, we had plenty of booze, we had good American rations, turkeys and all sorts then.
Yeah.
But when we moved up into the line in, I think about mid-January, I think it was about my birthday, which was 15th of January, off we went up and we took over a position on a hill called Point 210, overlooking the great Kazakhstan or 355 or Little Gibraltar it was called, over into a valley where the Wa was and the Chinamen were. And I took over from a troop of Canadian Lord Strathcona's horse who had Sherman tanks. And the frost had got well into the ground then, and they had pits dug, so the tanks were hull down on this ridge. But the Centurion wouldn't fit into the pits, so the engineers had to come up with explosives and enlarge these pits, and it was quite a job getting in. Mm-hmm. But then I was with an Australian company of 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, 3RAR, who'd again done extremely well in this op commando and had lost a lot of people, but had fought their way up onto the top of this great hill, 355, and established the position there. They were a battle-worn battalion. Mm. They all spoke a sort of Australian, and they called a young officer like me, I was called Skip. How are you, Skip, today? All right? Them 8th Hussars, they were a great lot. But one day, their commanding officer, Sir Guy Lowther, he came and he said, lads, it's Balaclava Day. And they all buggered off down the hill. They had a piss up, but they came back up again. You know, it was a great spirit in the Commonwealth Division. And Guy Lowther, who'd commanded the 8th Hussars, was a real commander with élan. He drove around in a dingo with a lance strapped to the front of it and was known by everybody. So there we were. We did our spell in the line, and the temperatures dropped at night to -30, and lovely sunny days in the daytime often. Right. While we were in reserve, interestingly, the Americans' command was always keen on thinking up peace talks, remember, were continuing at Panmunjom, but Arn Mike O'Daniel, when he met an officer or a soldier, his greeting was sharpen your bayonets. He was a real fighting soldier. And he wanted to keep the thing alive, and there was a plan that a squadron attack would take place up a subsidiary river to the Imjin called the Samichon, up this valley and turn left where the Chinese gun lines were. And he envisaged us doing a squadron attack with infantry. If we'd done it, we wouldn't have come back, definitely. Yeah. But for that reason, we troop leaders were sent out on patrol with the infantry, and Mickey Webber and I had an interesting time with the Royal Norfolk Regiment. We went out with a big fighting patrol. The great aim was to try and get a prisoner in the infantry world, and patrolling happened every night in the battalions. And so we went out with this 30-strong platoon, signaller with an 88 set. Officers in the infantry in those days didn't talk on the wireless. They was delegated it down to the operator, the signaller. And Mickey and I had, our armament was a .38 revolver, which was quite useless. So we all had captured, bartered American carbines. You could get any weapon you wanted for a bottle of whiskey or something. The squadron had, I think, 8 jeeps. There were only 2 on establishment. The others had been bought by the 8th Hussars with whiskey. You know, the American equipment was all over the place and just to be had for barter. and they were a dry army, and so whiskey was a very good commodity. Pretty shaming, really. Naffy were very efficient and got quantities forward to us. Anyway, we went on this patrol, we got to the river, and we waded in, and it was a good hard bottom, and the water only came up to just above our knees. But when we got out, immediately icicles formed on our trousers and went tinkle, 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 and the platoon commander said, "Stop that noise!" And on the way back, one was scared by pheasants getting up, and the reeds were all frozen and so crackled and made a noise. And we did bump into quite a large Chinese patrol who were doing the same thing. And this story it tells is very boring, but Mickey and I lay down, Hope soon went down, and we were beside the signaller. The platoon commander whispered to him, signal back and say, "We've hit a Chinese patrol, what shall we do?" And the chap did that in a rather laborious way. And we heard the message come back from the company commander, lie low and see what they do. But this signaller must have been reading sort of war books or something. He said, "We've got to take a prisoner." And Mickey and I thought this was going to be rather... We say he didn't say that at all. And we came to an agreement that we would lie low and see what they did. But it was quite an interesting little thing, and just it brought home what the life of the infantry was in the line. Yeah. Regular patrols nearly every night, and incoming shelling, and mines laid all over the country. Now, in our squadron, you're going to see Love, aren't you? Have you seen him already?
Yes, I have, yes.
And he described the mine incident, didn't he?
Yeah, he absolutely did, yes.
With Fergie Sutherland and all the rest of it.
Yes, he did.
So you know that story.
Awful.
And our role in the day was getting the order, being in the O group with the company commander who was doing the patrols of the night, liaising with the platoon commander who was doing the patrols, picking key spots where they foresaw trouble, because they would go out a couple of miles into no man's land and right up to the Chinese positions on this row of hills which was in front of us. And they would pick spots where they would like defensive HE fire to come down if called for. And you can imagine they would say, we targets A, B, C and D are there. And we would register them in the daytime. And the accuracy of the gun, even with HE, was such that we could guarantee, to cover an area, probably only of about 20 yards diameter. And this was much appreciated. If they were in trouble, they'd say over the radio, fire, target golf or whatever. I think the phonetic alphabet had changed. It was different then, but whatever it was. And we were able to do that. And the 20-pounder gun, which we'd got by then, was so accurate that there were these forays the infantry did, particularly onto a hill called 227, which faced us. And this was in my first time and second time in the line. And one supported company attacks, which were totally of no use at all, but it was the American idea of keeping things alive onto this hill. And each time a company went up, they lost people because the Chinese were tunnelled into the top of the hill, which had been so shelled that it was just a sort of bare earth thing, either covered in snow or later in the summer just sort of dry, dusty. But I did this 4 or 5 times for companies, and it was tragic, really, seeing casualties come for no purpose. There's no point. You couldn't hold the hill because you'd be shelled to bits.
So a lot of it was just really posturing whilst this phony peace was going on.
Indeed. Tragic. And if you, actually on the internet, if you just Google Hill 227, you see a picture of an Australian, later on in the summer it was, I was up on the side of 355 with my troop, and I was at an O group for this particular battalion, Australian company, the 1 RAR, 1st Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, doing a 227. And you see all the platoon commanders and the company commander, and in the corner you see me taking notes of the targets. And it's amazing that it's still on the internet. They all got MCs, every one of them.
Wow.
We didn't deserve one because we were sitting in our tanks very comfortably.
So that really was the sort of routine then, whilst you were forward.
Yeah.
I meant to ask earlier, when you first arrived, you had A Squadron forward and... Sorry, no,
C
Squadron
forward,
and you were A Squadron in the rear.
Yeah.
Was there a B Squadron there?
Yes, B Squadron. We only had at that time one squadron in the line.
Right.
Later, it was either, it varied. We supported the 2 British brigades, and I think on one occasion, well, I took over from Australians with Strathcona's horse first time, and then second time I was up, I was with 3 battalions, one after another, the Welsh, the Leicesters, and then 1 RAR, having taken over from RC Squadron.
Right.
B Squadron, which Jack Bellinger was in, C Squadron did 1 or 2 raids, in fact. They, under Harry Walker, were required to do this foray forward, and you'll have heard from Charles Taylor about that. Yes. Operation Jehu.
Jehu, yes, that's correct. Yes.
We supported Jehu from this hill, Bantua, and it was interesting that during it 2 things happened. One was they heard that the king had died, and the second, that Gilbert Monckton's son had been born to our squadron leader. Gilbert was very tensed up at that time.
I bet, yeah.
About that.
So, you again, painting a picture of a lot of close cooperation between the infantry, yourselves.
Yeah, we were amongst them, you see, right. On the hills.
Right. And of course the
artillery. That is a sort of typical picture of how it was there.
Right. So obviously the weather conditions not helping. You talk about icicles on your chops and
it was extremely cold.
Yeah.
And if you touched your tank, you lost your skin on your hand. You see, you had to wear gloves. Be very careful.
What about the equipment that you had? The cold weather equipment, was it up to the job?
Yeah, we were lucky. I mean, the first year, people were scrounging off the Americans to keep alive, but the British winter kit, when it came, was first rate. We had the equivalent of the modern combat kit. We had very good insoles in our boots, which gave you a layer of air under your sock. Long johns, string vests, which were quite thick skin, so when you got up in having slept, you know, if you looked at your back, if you had a chance, you were a pattern of wire netting, as it were. The woolly pullover, which came in then, and I think it was even in Korea the regiment managed to dye some of them green. You know, they were khaki woolly.
Well, yeah, I think it's part of the... I think I read it somewhere that the Skins were the first regiment to have a coloured regimental jumper, which then the whole army sort of took on.
I think
we
that's
ended up
about
with blues
right.
and greens.
And we managed, I think there's a picture of Arthur Carr and the squadron leaders and Henry Woods wearing their pullovers dyed green or whatever.
Excellent.
And then the outer parka was lined with sort of synthetic fur. It came right down, it had a tail to it, and you could pull the tail through your legs and button it up here. And there was a very good, effective hood with wire stiffening so that you could shape it as you wanted. That was very, very good winter kit. Right. And the gloves that went with it.
So clearly there was a lot of cooperation between yourselves and the infantry you were with, and also the artillery, whilst this was all going on. Were you under a lot of incoming fire at the time?
There was always the danger of incoming fire, particularly if if we upped the activity by Operation Jihu, Sea Squadron's attack. Their artillery was not so far away at this place called Kuwari, and we were within range, and we expected the heavy artillery, probably from 155s, who were within range. And our tragedy was Andrew Orbeck's troop out on point 159, and it was perhaps a bit unprofessional, but the pay and the rations was taken up by Ian Manning, the squadron second captain, to Andrew, and the additional activity on that very prominent position stuck out into the Chinese lines, attracted fire. Andrew was blown to bits, I'm afraid, and Ian Manning wounded and others with him. And it was really probably over-keenness in trying to get this stuff up during daylight that led to this tragedy. I was along the valley on the side of 355, and it was a horrible moment. You saw the flash and the bang, and very soon on the squadron net, the messages started coming back.
Right.
Sunray down and so on.
So the Chinese were watching, and any movement on the hillside.
Particularly in that position.
The forward one, yes. Right.
Now, where I was on the side of 355, this was the position from which we supported the infantry on these slightly unnecessary but demanded by the higher command attacks on point 227. And when the infantry put in one of these attacks, the artillery came back in on us, and we stayed turret down. Well, we were in hull down position. We stayed inside and hoped for the best. My tank was hit with Trooper Bell inside it. He was known as Dinger Bell anyway, fairly obviously, and he said, "I felt like the clapper of the bell when this." It was a nearby round. It took the bins off one side of the turret, but it didn't do any harm. But
right.
It was rather noisy for Bell. I was somewhere else, at an O group or something.
So if you weren't in the tanks at the time, I take it you had shelters or trenches.
Yeah, we did. We dug into the hills. We called them. They were called hutches. Rabbit hutch, hutches, Australian.
Right.
And they were sandbagged, holes into the ground. And it wasn't particularly segregation, because as you well know on exercises and everything, a Centurion crew slept behind its tank, 1, 2, 3, 4. But in this case, we were there so long, normally the troop leader had a separate hutchie of his own. And when I first went into the line, I think I mentioned we took over from Canadians, Lord Strathcona's horse. Their ammunition came in beautiful wooden boxes. And these Strathcona people, they built the troop leader's hutchie well into the ground, and it was panelled with wood. There was just room to stand up as you went in, and then there was a sleeping space, panelled. And there was the thing that caused as many casualties as any other. The method of heating in the winter we used was pretty shambolic. You had a can of diesel outside, a rubber tube feeding down an old aerial to a shell casing and a chimney, and you controlled the flow of this no, petrol it was, not diesel, down, and it burnt in there. And if all went well and you regulated the supply of petrol, you got an almost red-hot sort of chimney thing within your bunker. If it went wrong, of course, you had to get out very quickly because you were in a petrol fire. I think it was petrol that was used. There were certainly many disasters when things went wrong, but you were very grateful if you could regulate this heating arrangement. It was very, very efficient.
So apart from keeping yourself warm, or attempting to keep yourself warm without setting yourself on fire, what about the other morale-boosting things like food and washing?
For food, when you were in the line, you had the American, I think they're called K rations. They came in an oblong box, and in it were, I think, main meals, ham and lima beans and the other choices. Some were more popular than others. There was a pudding one. There was always loo paper and a packet of 20 cigarettes, Camel or Marlboro, all American stuff. And orange juice or something, tinned orange juice. And it was all right, but you got very bored of it. So you were even quite pleased to get back on British Compo when you were in reserve. And of course, we had, who was quartermaster? Len Green and Freddie Birchall were ace people at scrounging. And the American supply system was quite incredible. They had food, Coca-Cola machines, everything in the rear areas. And we had efficient people who acquired stocks of this food. Turkey particularly. Turkeys were available for cooking, and so we could, in reserve, we could reinforce, our cooks could reinforce the rations considerably. Cleanliness was difficult. If you had we had Korean boys attached to the squadron to sort of do semi-laundry, but as they did the washing in 40-gallon drums over smoky diesel fires, in fact, if you put in a decent shirt, it came up pretty sooty and perhaps sweat-free, but not very attractive. We each had a tin trunk back in B echelon where we kept sort of clothes we used when we had our 5 days rest and recuperation in Tokyo. And you could ask for your tin box to come up, and then you'd kick yourself up in something a bit more presentable and go on the aeroplane for your 5 days leave. What went on in that 5 days doesn't really bear talking about, but there we are.
No, we'll probably leave that out then. Right. So actually, there was time then to get away.
Each person got 5 days, R&R, in the year. But otherwise, you made your own fun when you were in reserve. And in the winter in reserve, we froze over a paddy field, by damming up a stream, and the boys played a form of shinty on that with hockey, sort of make up hockey sticks and so on. And in the summer, Peter Duckworth was an ace in creating really quite a large swimming pool with muddy banks, but deep, and we had squadron swimming sports in it and all sorts in the summer. The summer wasn't very pleasant. It was, I think a lot of us had a bout of malaria without really knowing it, because very sticky heat in June, July, and unpleasant, a lot of bugs about. Snakes you had to be careful of. The spring was a lovely time when all the azalea trees on the bushes on the hills came out, and it was quite beautiful. Right. Also some game shooting went on. The 8th Hussars, being very old cavalry when they went out, their commanding officer put out an edict or a note to the officers. I believe there is game in Korea, so I advise officers to take out a gun. Not a best gun, but a gun, because there may be some shooting there. We followed on. I'd been given a gun by an uncle who looted it, I think, and it was perfectly adequate, 12 bore. And I went shooting with the Shropshire Light Infantry when they were out of the line. A lot of pheasants, a lot of quail. We shot with Colonel David Rose, who commanded the Black Watch, was a great friend of Harry Walker and Jeff Brundle-Brown, who commanded C Squadron and A Squadron respectively. And we went on shoots with some of the Black Watch officers and him when we were all in reserve. Shot pheasant and quail, little tiny quail, which very good eating. Strange life.
Right, absolutely. What about regimental headquarters? Always the same when the squadrons are up. How do they entertain themselves?
Well, of course, Charles may have told you a bit about this, because he had a time as assistant adjutant.
He did. Yes.
Henry Woods was adjutant. And Gilbert Monckton moved from commanding A Squadron to be second in command. And being Gilbert, immediately acquired bantams, a tortoise, and all sorts of other animals which he looked after in his quaint, eccentric way. We, of course, in the squadrons saw very little of RHQ. Arthur Carr came round regularly when you were in the line, and Dick Vickers after him when he took over command. And we troop leaders, when we were in the line, were all a bit scathing about squadron headquarters because, they'd come and see us, yes, and they were useful for bringing up the mail and the rations.
Yes.
But then, of course, poor A squadron headquarters, got quite heavily blasted and quite a lot of casualties in A squadron headquarters. And I went back early because to take my regular commissions board, so I left in October, and the regiment didn't leave till December. Trooper Grace was killed while I was on the troop ship, in my troop. And one of the unpleasant things to do, but became rather heartwarming because of the reaction, was to go and see Grace's parents down in East London. And one thinks of the sort of formality of the day. I had to go down wearing a bowler hat because that was the correct thing to do in those days.
Right, yeah, yes.
And saw them, and of course they were absolutely charming, and they wanted to know about how Jim had been and was he cheerful and all that. Right.
What was the notification system like in terms of communications? That sort of administration, if people were lost?
I think it was very efficient.
Right, yes.
I mean, none like today when everybody has mobile telephones and everything. The signals set up in divisional headquarters was very efficient.
Right.
And home headquarters was sent comforts and messages, and the wives were fairly widely scattered, as I remember. I mean, not being concerned with that. I think quite a lot of the wives were found quarters in Colchester, which had been an old cavalry station, and so the older soldiers would know Colchester well. Perhaps some were in Aldershot, I don't know. But a sort of letter went round the families from the regiment. All this, I think, is quite well recorded in the journals of the day, the particular journal. Casualties by shelling or mortaring or mines went back either to the British Field Ambulance or the Indian one. The Indian one was highly regarded. They were an Indian parachute field hospital, field ambulance, sort of company strength. And people look at the films of MASH, which of course were made much later about Korea, but in Vietnam, or at that time.
Yes.
I wasn't wounded, luckily, but friends who were said they were hugely well treated by the casualty evacuation system.
Right. Oh, that's
We had
good to hear.
Ammunition was brought up by a squadron tug, which was a Centurion without a turret, and very useful for getting stores up to the line. Recce troop were not much used. They were in dingoes, I think, and they were very unstable on these sort of track roads, which are really only bulldozed out by the Royal Engineers.
Right.
And
Well, you mentioned that you had to come back early.
yeah.
What happened to you after that?
Well, I went to my RCB in Westbury and successful, passed that. And then I went to Bovington on a 3-month radio course with a view to becoming signals officer, which I did become in the Canal Zone, where the regiment were, as they left Korea and the time expired, national servicemen went on home, and the regiment stopped on the Little Bitter Lake at Chandler and took over tanks from the 4th Tank Regiment, 4th Royal Tank Regiment, who, I'm afraid it is rather said, but I wasn't there because I'm on my course, they'd slightly rusticated with nothing much to do, and the regiment had a lot to do to put their Centurions up to our standard.
Right.
But that went on, and the regiment settled down in Chandler for a year-long stay.
And of course, the regiment didn't know when they were in Korea that they were going to then be spending another year. Or those
there were
who
all sorts of rumours as to where
Right.
we might go.
Yeah.
It was thought that we might go to North Africa, to Benghazi, where in fact the Greys were stationed. And I was lucky as signals officer. I took her on a ship, the signals vehicles up to do an exercise with, I think it was called 23rd Armoured or 25th Armoured Brigade, commanded by a skin, John Anderson, who later became Colonel of the regiment, with the Greys, and I think just the Greys and an infantry battalion. Anyway, we went up on this jaunt, really, and had an exercise in the desert with our signals vehicles, which was great fun. And we had a Greys squadron attached to us in Chandler. For what particular reason, I can't think, to give them a bit of an outing from Benghazi.
And they were also on Centurions
Yes.
at the time.
Yeah.
Right, okay. What about RHQ and personalities? Who was
Well, Arthur Carr commanded us to begin with,
right?
and then Dick Vigors took over.
Yeah.
There was unpleasantness in that Dick Vigors, although he got a DSO, for some reason, it was thought he wasn't suitable to take command. I don't know why. And there was that, and this is rather regimental gossip, a carbineer called Colonel Lee was groomed to come and take over. But the story goes that the regiment objected to this sort of Director of the Royal Armour Corps decision, and Gilbert Monckton's father, Sir Walter Monckton, or was he the Viscount, I can't remember, was in the House of Lords and brought the matter up. And poor old Colonel Lee bought all the uniform and then was told he wasn't going to command after all.
Wow.
I don't know whether that should be recorded or not, I don't know.
It is now.
And I hope I got it right. But it certainly happened. And Dick Vigors proved to me an admirable commanding officer in Korea and back in Chandler.
Right.
Squadron leaders, A Squadron Gilbert and then Chef Blundell Brown. B Squadron Mike Tompkin, much loved by his troop leaders. C Squadron Harry Walker, much loved by his troop leaders and a great extrovert character.
Yes.
Just got married to Patsy, and his Sergeant Major, Ginty or Gilliland, about the only Irishman in the regiment, but a wonderful Squadron Sergeant Major. he used to ration the letters that came for Harry, because if he didn't have one every day, he was in a very bad mood. It was known as an ink storm day. So if 2 letters came one day, Ginty kept one back in case one didn't come the next day.
Quite right. So, now, interesting point you raised there about there only being one Irishman, or very few Irishmen in the regiment, because it was something I've found throughout the interviews that there's always I had always assumed incorrectly that there was always a large proportion of Irishmen in the regiment. But of course, during the National Service days, even before the war, there were very few Irishmen in the regiment.
Very few. You see, there was never any conscription in North or South Ireland. The cavalry of the line moved between the cavalry stations, which were York, Colchester and Aldershot, basically. So you will find in the regiment a lot of the senior ranks came pre-war from York or Colchester. Sergeant Major Clayton, a perfect example. Jack Clayton, who'd got an MM later, but was on the regimental trick ride up till 1937. Yes. Great horseman. What was I going to say? And the RAC in the war demanded the higher IQ person, and so as conscripts joined the cavalry regiments, very few would come from Ireland, not because they were stupid, but because there was no conscription in Ulster. Right. And Ulstermen tended to join the Ulster Rifles, the Inniskillings, Fusiliers,
yes,
those two, right. Or join the Gunners, and so few came into the Armoured Corps, and the Armoured Corps tended to be English, Welsh, or Scottish. The Scots Greys, an example, would get Scotsmen, and of course the Territorials. Yeomanry regiments played a huge part in the Armoured Corps in the war. Harry Walker started in the Fife and Forfar Yeomanry, and they had 2 lines, as they called them. If a yeomanry regiment had a second one, they called it the second line regiment.
Yes,
and both first and second Fife and Forfar had many battle honours in North Africa and on into Italy and Normandy. I think I'm not sure about Italy. So we didn't get the influx of Irishmen until the end of national service, when suddenly we almost had to learn a new language, because General John Anderson was then director of the Armoured Corps, and end of national service, cavalry regiments started recruiting in areas, and we in the Irish Hussars were given Ulster, and so this flood came in. And we couldn't understand what they said.
So prior to that, when you joined, had you joined an Irish regiment, or had you joined a regiment that had an Irish town name in its title?
The latter.
Right.
The Inniskilling was a name in the title. Many people talked about being in the 5th Dragoon Guards because it was shorter. It wasn't being rude to the Inniskillings in any way.
Right.
And in fact, our staff duties title, I think, when I joined, was 5DG, and then they put the Innis in it. Our shortened staff duties title.
Right. So were we in those days? Were we known as the Skins? Was that a regular nickname?
Yes.
Yes, it was.
Yes.
Right. Okay.
Yes, definitely that.
Yeah. That's interesting.
But very few Irishmen. I can't think of it. There were none in my troop. We tended, of course, with the Cheshire Yeomanry connection, we did have quite a lot of people from Cheshire and Lancashire. And it was a good recruiting area.
Right. That's very interesting. Thank you. So after the Canal Zone, if that's right, what happened next? Where did the regiment head to?
We went up to be the training regiment in Cashel.
Right.
I've moved that. Does that matter?
No, that's fine. I think we're still on. Yeah.
And I spent, just being personal, I had a very short time as a GMT troop leader, where you had an intake of 50 or 60 national servicemen, and you taught them map reading, and they were drilled and so on and so on. And then I was very lucky in that I was sent on a 3-month equitation course with the Blues in Windsor, which with Mike Anstis and another officer who didn't stay very long. Mike Anstis got a very good MC in Korea at the Battle of the Hook, as you may have covered. And that was great fun. And then I was appointed adjutant of the Cheshire Yeomanry, taking over from Guy Wathen. And of course I knew everybody, and it was very easy for me. And we were in the grounds of a big Victorian house on the outskirts of Chester, where we had a tank hangar with about 6 Centurions.
Okay.
And dear Jack Clayton was the RSM, and he'd been my squadron cell major in Korea. Had a very difficult time with one sergeant we had to court-martial, but we perhaps better won't go into that.
No, okay.
After I lived in the depot of the Cheshire Regiment, who were very good to me. And we went to... the first camp we had was cancelled because of a rail strike, and of course that was the be-all and end-all of the yeomanry year. And then Prue and I got married. Her family were living in Cheshire at that time, and my sister had known her family for a long time anyway. But we a bit before that, we'd got together, and we lived in married quarters, territorial married quarters in Chester.
Right.
And
I believe at that time there were quite a few. There were some major cuts in the yeomanry at that time.
Not quite then.
Not then.
No,
Okay.
the yeomanry were flourishing because every national serviceman had a commitment to do territorial service for a period, I think, of 2 years. I'm not quite sure. And that lasted through my time as with the yeomanry, which was ended in 57, I think. We were married in 55. So I did 2.5 years, 54 to 57, right. And then I was sent to Monkey Blacker, who was commanding, who I didn't know very well because he wasn't in a very up-and-coming soldier. He wasn't in the Orbat for Korea. He was doing some high-powered job with the chief of the Imperial General Staff then. But he'd interviewed me as a trooper, and he then, when I was with the yeomanry, came and visited the yeomanry and stayed with us, and we were very worried having the commanding officer staying, but it all went quite well. Prue being not, very aware of the army at that time. Right. And he said, you've got to go on a 1-year tank technology course. I said, I don't want to, thank you very much. But actually, it was great fun. We lived down in a wonderful hiring over Larworth Cove.
Oh, right.
And had to move halfway through because the woman wanted it back. But we had a good year, and we'd had our first daughter was born just before we moved there. And then I went out to the regiment in Senelaga.
And what was the point of the course? Was this is it a new course or?
It was a year-long tank technology to equip you to be in an armoured regiment, the technical adjutant. And you did a bit of everything. You did virtually a lot of D&M and gunnery, but not wireless because I'd done a wireless course already. And then you did a lot of visits to Remy at Borden to learn about what went into the boxes that ran the stabiliser, which I never understood. It went over our heads, but it was an interesting course.
Right. And this was to line you up to
be technical adjutant.
Technical adjutant.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Which I did in 58, 59.
Right. And then, so you then returned to the regiment as a married officer.
Yeah.
To, I believe, Senelager, which is where the regiment
That's
were.
right, Athlone Barracks, Senelager. And we
Um,
lived in Andergrimka.
I know it well, yes.
Do you?
Yeah, I do, yeah. I used to live in Trotterstrasse, just round the corner.
Oh,
Yeah. So life in Germany then, what was that like in those days? Has it moved on from Paderborn? Was it?
Yes. BOR was well established with a way of life. I think we skins were good with our tanks. We were good with our gunnery when we went up to Salta, to Bergen, whatever you call it, Belsen, Bergen-Hohne, to shoot ranges, NATO ranges. And there were major autumn exercises, and then a lot of sport, which the regiment excelled at.
Yes.
Football, rugby, cricket, and I think sort of things like running and all the rest of it was encouraged. Monkey Blacker, I missed his period of command. He went in for boxing as commanding officer, which is a bit over and above the call of duty, we thought. But he was like that.
That was very much his style.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He did everything, and of course was a wonderful horseman. And equitation was again encouraged. We had polo ponies in Schloss Neuhaus. We were not very well off as officers to have good polo ponies, but we tried very hard. Richard Keatley was a very good player, and I was in our scratch team, and we muddled through and had great fun.
So Richard Keatley was the commanding officer?
Richard Keatley. He was then adjutant, I think.
Oh, right. Okay.
Richard Keatley.
Yeah. Okay.
We were commanded by Mike Tompkin, who was charming, and I think we were a very happy regiment. And we were, funnily enough, we were over the hill with the 9th Lancers, who always thought they were a bit bright and shiny. And the 10th Hussars were in Paderborn, and they thought they were even brighter and shinier. The shiny 10th.
Right.
And we all had great fun together.
So your role as the technical adjutant, that's the correct title.
Was to keep the, however many tanks on the road and B vehicles, and we had a technical quartermaster was dear Freddie Birchall, a great character who'd been a trooper in the bays before the war when they had horses, and came to the skins after the war. Yeah. And the quartermaster became a huge friend.
Right.
Dear Freddie, it always makes me cry. He liked looking after our elder daughter if we, were going away for a weekend or something, and they didn't have any children. When he died, he left her £500 in his will.
Oh, top man.
Upset me a bit.
Yes. They're good characters, weren't they? Yeah, absolutely. So life in Germany, I think you were there for a fairly short time before moving on.
Well, I had 2 years back with the regiment before, much to Mike Tompkins' surprise, 3 of us, we passed the staff college, were selected to go to the staff college. Alan Findlay, Anthony Millen and I, which left a bit of a gap for him in captains. But
I can imagine, yeah. Stripped out. So what about the staff college? What are your memories from that time?
Well, on the whole, happy ones. I was, because I'd been on this tank technology course, I was selected to go on a 3-month course at Shrivenham beforehand, where about 30 of us behaved rather badly in front of our rather more technical superiors and teased certain gunners who tried to teach us ballistics and things, but But anyway, that was a good time. Prue had to go and stay with her parents in Cheshire then, and I commuted in the weekends.
Right.
I shouldn't tell this story, but we had one most amusing officer in the Coldstream who I arrived on the course in my Mini Traveller, you know, those rather nice cars, Morris's, which had a wooden bit at the back.
Right, yes, I remember them.
Small brake. Alistair Tarr arrived in a huge gate car, driven by his soldier servant in the Coldstream, wearing one of those white banded hats that they wore. And he became a huge friend, that he was very laid back and very well off in the manner of the languid Coldstream officer. And we were all told to, during the course, to give a lecturette lasting about a quarter of an hour on a scientific subject, and go to the library and perhaps pick a subject from a magazine called, I don't know, A Scientific World or something. Well, Alistair picked a subject of, it was nuclear propulsion for space research, and he put that in. And it sounded so interesting, everybody came to it. And this I don't know if you've been to a Shrivenham classroom, they have a big desk for Bunsen burners on it and high up, and then the people all sitting. So Alistair got up behind this desk, and the Commandant General Hackett came. And Alistair said, with a very solemn expression, he said, I do believe that demonstration goes home far better than mere words and so could you please all go outside? Where Guardsman Turner let off a big rocket he'd bought in Harrods, and that was his lecture. And he was up in front of General Hackett the next morning.
I'm surprised. For another rocket, yeah.
But it was taken very long. And then we had the year, and I was lucky, I was in the separate bit called C Division, which was out at Minley, and so we went into central lectures. We had a shambolic hiring in Crowthorne, and I had a Vespa to get about with then, with one of those windshields, which as long as it wasn't raining too hard, you could motor along and be fairly dry. So I motored into Minley every day, and when we went to lectures, a friend was a naval officer who became a full admiral in the end. He would sit on the back of my Vespa and we motored into the lectures, and we took it fairly light-heartedly. And
that's one should.
But people were very serious about their next job. But my stroke of luck was that of the three of us, two went to staff jobs, and Alan Findlay and Tony Millen, and I went back to the regiment to command B Squadron. And Harry Walker was commanding by then, and he was such a good chap to work for. He was very well off. He was extremely efficient. He'd been instructed at Sandhurst, and he'd been a divisional, the important staff officer in a division. In those days was the G2 of a division, was a key person. And he just was relaxed, and we were in the Guards Brigade, 4th Guards Brigade, who were stationed way down in the Ruhr at Hubelrath, and they were commanded by somebody called John Nelson, a brigadier from the Grenadiers, and he and Harry were lifelong friends, and they both had Bentleys, which sort of added a bit of tone. And I'm rather being a bit flippant about all this, but there is no doubt that Harry knew exactly what was going on, and just encouraged one. And I was quite young to be a squadron leader. The others were Henry Woods, you see, who was wartime MC, was commanding A Squadron, and Charles, I think Guy Wharton first, and then Charles Fisher, C Squadron, older than me, and Charles Taylor was Headquarters Squadron. And I was solidly for the 2 years with the Welsh Guards, who were very, hospitable to their armoured squadron, and were out and about a lot because they were certainly marking the fact that they liberated Brussels, and we went for a long period away training together, first of all down at Vogelsang, the other side of the Rhine, in the Eifel Mountains, and then in Borg-Leopold in Belgium itself. And we got on terribly well together. They had an extraordinary commanding officer who was a bachelor called Vivian Wallace, and I can picture him now. He was a chain smoker, and we were at Vogelsang, pouring with rain. We were under a rather inefficient sort of shelter, and the company commanders all had their map boards and papers there. And Vivian sat in the end, and I was there with my map board too, and the gunner. And he had a spaniel, which had been out in the mud. So it ran around jumping on all the commanders' map boards. And he would give his orders. He was very switched on, but he would have a cigarette in one hand. He'd move the one he was smoking over to that corner of his mouth, put the new one in there, take the old one out, light the new one from the old one, and on it went, just solid chain smoking. Quite extraordinary.
That's a determined smoker.
So that was 2 happy years with B Squadron, and I think everything went very well. We had very good troop leaders. James Rucker, who went on to command the Queen's Engineers. Rafe Cowdy, who's just died. Mad Irishman.
Yeah, I've met him.
But a delightful character.
Very much so.
Ray Kelly, who was another thing altogether, was my second in command to begin with. And then Alistair Campbell, who was charming and died recently. And then Nick Ansell. Now, Nick was a bit of a problem because...
I'm going to love to hear this.
on exercises, he'd come back from Oxford, you see, and didn't know an awful lot about armoured soldiering, but his crew were very good to him. But when we were out on these long exercises, racing was the thing, and he'd always managed to get a copy of Sporting Life. One morning, we'd been in the edge of a village all night, and we got a bit of sleep, but not much. And then the order to move came in the daytime, and Ansel was well down in his turret. When the order to move came, he'd forgotten that his gun was right over the side. So driver advanced, and the gun swept the top off a German house where an old lady was in bed.
Wow.
I think it's true, that story.
I did ask him about that because it is recorded in the regimental journal that he demolished a German pub, which is obviously this building. But he didn't expand on that when I asked him. That's brilliant. Now, what about? I have to ask. Hasn't come up. What about the Ansell Cup? Was the Ansell Cup something that you got involved in when you first joined the regiment? Was that?
No, I think, you see, Nick's father, Mike Ansell, took over as colonel of the regiment from Charles Keatley, and took a huge interest. As you know, he was blind, but he would come out and go around the ranks and talk to everybody, and you'd think he could see you. But he had to have an ADC with him, just sort of guiding him round. But I think it was during his colonelcy that he gave this cup to be given to the most efficient overall troop, and it was competed for. I can't honestly remember whether a B Squadron troop won it or not.
Right. But it was certainly part of the...
It was part of
cycle.
the yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that.
And during that 2 years, of course, we had a new standard. And that was a great occasion. It was fairly informally done. We didn't have a member of the royal family. I think General Charles Keatley gave the standard. And there was Nick Ansell was certainly in charge of the sort of
think it was the Honour Guard.
The Honour Guard.
Yeah.
And I commanded B Squadron in tanks flanking the parade. So that was our job. We sort of jumped in and out of our tanks.
And did you have, was there a mixture of, did each squadron have a Conqueror tank troop?
Yes.
Then, right, so
Yeah.
it was a mixture of...
They were quite useless, but we
Right.
did. Great lumbering 80-ton things.
What was the main problem with the Conqueror tank? Is it not
Well,
too
it
big?
was too heavy for the country, really. It got bogged down regularly. And firing the thing, you put a round in, a separated round, and then a thing as big as a dustbin behind that, and a huge bang. It was over-egged. I think people had been frightened of the German Tiger, and they thought they must have this enormous thing, but it never. There's one awful incident when in my Conqueror troop, Sergeant Edmondson was commanding was the troop sergeant, and his tank ran away down a hill, and Sergeant Edmondson jumped off to his eternal shame. The tank actually rumbled on and ended up in a wood somewhere. Oh dear. But it was a fun time. The standard parade went very well. Jim Boardman was RSM, and not a great horseman, but the standard party were mounted. And on the rehearsal, Harry Walker, who wasn't a great drill man, it sounded belting with rain, and we were, I think, he didn't want us to get wet in our uniform, so instead of saying dismiss, well, he said dismiss, and so the regiment didn't quite know what to do. Some turned round and some bolted for barracks. The horses bolted back to the stables 1.5 miles with Boardman and others aboard.
General, so having spent 2 years as OC of B Squadron in Senlager, what was on the cards for you next?
Well, I was due to do a staff job, and I don't think I distinguished myself at the staff college particularly. So I was very happy to be told that I was going to Singapore to work in what was then Singapore-based district, and have the G2 job dealing with internal security of the island. Just before I left, a tragedy struck B Squadron in that on a last exercise, literally 3 weeks before we left, Sergeant Major Garrigan, who was an outstanding Squadron Sergeant Major, was killed. He was directing tanks across the road running, I think, north from Hameln, and a German chose not to take any direction, overtook all the cars and just ran down Garrigan, who was killed. And it was an absolute tragedy. It just spoilt the end of our tour with the squadron, because he was an outstanding person. He'd actually come from the 1st Royal Tank Regiment. I think he'd been with the regiment about 5 years, but was hugely popular. And I was a bit late arriving in Singapore and got a rocket for that, because obviously we had to stay for the service in at Hanover at the military cemetery there, and that was a tragedy. But we had a very happy time with B Squadron, apart from that last horrible incident.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Yes. So Singapore.
Singapore was
Must have been a
well, it was
bit of a
amazing.
change from Senlager.
Yes, and you see, we went out with 2 girls. Day was, I think, about 6 or so, and Georgie 5 years behind, only really just 18 months. And we flew out, and I was told I would never leave Singapore because internal security was very important, and this, that, and the other. Well, I'd only been there a fortnight, and we were on an exercise most of that time about internal security, when, working overnight in the headquarters, I was told to issue ammunition to 2 battalions, because something was happening in Brunei, and I duly looked up the book and issued this ammunition to the Queen's Own Highlanders and the 1st, 2nd Gurkhas. And then Ordnance Corps people rang up and said, you must be very new here. You have to indent for 6 months with ammunition, things like that. And my boss, who was Frank Coates, KOSB, Scottish Borderers, who'd captained Scotland at rugby football, rang me in the morning and said, Mike, you're on a list and you're off to Brunei, be up at GHQ at 11:30 as brigade major of a little force going to put down the revolt in Brunei. So I was taken back to where Prue was trying to move into a hiring we'd just got, and I said, I'm going to Brunei. And she said, don't be silly, there's a place called Bosnia, but there's nobody called Brunei. Anyway, you've got to unpack all these MFO boxes and take the Palmers swimming. Don't you remember? You promised it. It wasn't like that. And then happened the most amazing fortnight of my life. Off we went. Didn't have any of the right clothes. I come straight from Germany. Got in this aircraft. The back end of a Gurkha battalion were there, looking very warlike. And then we landed at the island of Labuan, and there were Gurkha casualties being evacuated back. Then saw the Queen's Own Highlanders being piped aboard a Beverley aircraft to recapture the oil field, which is the wealth of Brunei, Syria oil field. Then moved into the town where there were Gurkhas on every corner looking warlike, curfew, chaos in the police station. We took the middle floor, and it was, for somebody who's been used to BOR secretary, it was a bit of a change. Wireless went, HMS Albion here, 3 commando embarked, what shall we do? And it went on like that for a fortnight, when our tiny staff were took General Walter Walker with 17 Gurkha Div, produced 300 people to do the job that 8 of us had done. I then went back and had happy years. Malaysia Day came, Singapore district closed. Prue had arranged that I would be polo manager to the Sultan of Johor, which I had to do, and it was quite interesting. 3 Malays, 2 of whom one was later the king or Agong, and a pretty strange person, and his cousin, and then the head stable lad who was charming, and Major Swindells made up the Johor state team for the next 2 years, and I couldn't afford to buy a pony in Singapore, so it was all free for me, but hard work. And I was MA to a general in the Joint Headquarters and saw through Malaysia Day and everything. Most intriguing 2 years.
So where was your married quarter, or your hiring within?
Well, we had to move 5 times. To begin with, on the Watton Estate, which is near the Bukit Timah racecourse, and if you scraped the walls, you could see where British prisoners of war who weren't in Changi had been incarcerated under the Japs. And then we moved to another hiring, and then to a flat in Orchard Road, and very finally, because I was working as MA to a general, we got a little tiny quarter in Tanglin, which was very attractive. But I mean, it was a pre-war sergeant's quarter, but perfectly adequate for us, and we had a very happy time there.
What was the political situation like in Singapore itself at that time, in your final year?
Well, Singapore happily was quiet. Lee Kuan Yew was in charge. They came under the banner of Malaysia then. Later they broke apart. But all the focus was on what was happening in North Borneo, Sabah, Brunei and Sarawak. And, we had this major force built up, and the Navy were in the naval base in great strength. There was confrontation with Indonesia and the threat of all-out war with Sukarno. And the army built up, and brigades were scattered throughout Borneo from Sabah down to Sarawak, and this jungle warfare was taking place. I was working for a general called Tony Lascelles, very intelligent Royal Tank Corps officer, but he was so intellectual, he didn't like people very much. I found it quite difficult. Mm-hmm. And my outlet was a huge number of friends who were there, and this requirement to go up to Johor whenever I could to school polo ponies. And we eventually, Johor being a pretty jungly, managed to beat Singapore Polo Club, where of course most of my army friends were a member of.
Oh, just the job.
Nice. It was a very intriguing 2 years.
Excellent. So after, I take it you're 2 years away, you were heading back to the regiment after that?
I was heading back to the regiment. Regiment were in Aden. We had a brief spell dumping Prue back with her parents in Dorset, and I went out to Aden, and Henry Woods was commanding. And having commanded B Squadron, I was a bit cheesed off to be told I was to command Headquarters Squadron. But the regiment then were hugely scattered. C Squadron were in Hong Kong under Tony Moore. A and B Squadrons under my greatest friend David Rurt and a huge friend Peter Welsh, a bit younger than me, and I thought it was a bit cheeky that he was commanding a sailor squadron, rotated between being in Bahrain, floating around in a naval ship, or being in Aden. Well, I came out to Aden, and I was met by Tim Goshen, who was to be my second in command. And Tim had done time with the Aden Protectorate levies and was an Arabist. And he wanted to get into the Arab world, and he was accepted by the political people there, a sort of branch of MI6 who worked up country. And he and others were the saving, for me, made the next year absolutely fantastic, actually, because as Headquarters Squadron leader, I got Sergeant Major Bertie Bertrand as Squadron Sergeant Major, who's an old friend and great chap. But we'd got most of the manpower in Aden in Headquarters Squadron, because only just A Squadron there, or B Squadron, whichever was not in Bahrain. And we got a lot of amusing young people in the mess. Henry was commanding with Imogen out. Charles Gilchrist Fisher, second in command, was our best man and a huge, great friend. And there was a Coldstream battalion there. Welsh Guards battalion came. There was polo in Cormaxa. We had a very amusing... one of my military outlets was that the Recce Troop was commanded by Briss Boville, and they were normally up in Haberlane operating in the Radfan. So I'd go and spend time up with them, part of my job, much better than sitting in the office sort of writing reports or something. And it turned out to be a most amusing year. We had young Geoffrey Kent in the regiment, who later sort of boosted his family firm of Abercrombie and Kent by marrying several American heiresses and making it a hugely profitable travel business. But he organised that a polo team of Paddy Shillington, Briss Boville, himself and myself went down for a fortnight in Kenya and had 2 tournaments there, and we were treated like royalty, thanks to Geoffrey knowing everybody.
Yes.
It was very good. It was a very happy year. The regiment, the role was an armoured regiment with only one squadron there, but we were beside the 10th Hussars for most of the time, and they had people up in the country, and they were a very nice regiment. We got terribly well together. Turn the thing off for a moment. As we came to the end of that year in Aden, the regiment was to move to Benghazi with one squadron, to go to Cyprus in the United Nations Ferit role. And that was A Squadron. And I took over A Squadron from my great friend David Rurt. And because we'd been in Aden for 2 years, we were allowed to have our wives out, although we were on what had been a 6-month unaccompanied UN tour. And so dear Patrick Brooking, who I think had been in Northern Ireland with the North Irish Horse, or had he been Brigade Major out in Northern Ireland? Anyway, he came out ahead of us as second in command of A Squadron to me, and he, by sheer guts, found quarters, married quarters, hirings, for all the squadron wives, despite huge opposition from the RAF, of course. This was in Limassol, and
Right.
all the RAF from Akrotiri, a very big station, were based in Limassol. But he did it, and so in due course, Prue and I flew out from England after my leave at home, and we had a very happy year there before I went off to 7th Armoured Brigade as my time to be a staff officer again.
Because looking back, I mean, you've had quite a, in terms of being married, you've had quite a bit of, Singapore or Senalaga, Singapore, and then being separated,
Yeah.
and then joining back together again in Cyprus. So quite a difficult time.
Yeah, but we had, I mean, Singapore was a very happy time for both of us. Aden was, Prue didn't see me. She seemed to think there was some reason that I was on some sort of holiday camp.
I'm sure they all think that, yes, yeah.
And then we had Cyprus again, which was a very happy year.
Right.
And I had an ace team with Patrick Brooking, Andy Evans, James Rucker came, and very amusing subalterns. And there was only one pretty girl on the island, she was called Melissa, and that wretched fellow accordingly came over and snapped her up, and my subalterns were very upset.
I won't say anything at this point with the microphone on, yes.
But we bought two. With the Hunt and Polo Fund, I'd arranged that we bought 6 good polo ponies from a 1420 squadron who'd come over from Benghazi with these ponies, and they're on a 6-month tour. So we bought the lot, and that meant that our squadron team were actually cock of the hoop on Cyprus for polo. There was one other good player, much better than... I got a reasonable handicap by the time of Singapore, but Peter Thompson Glover, a 9th Lance, was on the staff, and he was a very good player. But the RAF, in rank from the CNC, the Sasso, which is the number 2, the Commander Akrotiri, and the Group Captain Ops, were the RAF team, and A Squadron of the Skins could beat them quite easily. But the CNC had an invitation to play polo in Jordan, and Peter Thompson Glover and I were in that team, and we were all given gold watches by King Hussein, and it was a very fun year. And the boys, the troop leaders, were out. It was at a time when the Turks were being given absolute hell by the Greek Sips, and each village on the map had a red line under it or a blue line under it, whether it's a Turkish village or a Greek village, and the Greeks were behaving appallingly. No wonder the Turks invaded later in 1974.
Yes.
But our troop leaders would go around a village and they'd check on things, and there were incidents and firings, and very difficult in some of the mountain roads on the west of the island, which was our area, to get the vehicles around. And what happened was that Paphos district, quite large, the western end of the island from Paphos Katima up to Polis was looked after by the British battalion on a 6 months tour. But when they changed over, I was made commander of the district and had 2 companies of the old battalion and 2 companies of the new battalion under command. And we had, first of all, the Highland Fusiliers, then the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, then the Black Watch. And it was such fun for us because we got on so well with all of them. And they were all very good battalions, different in their ways. But
Yes.
it was a boost for our boys because, you know, these troop leaders were regarded by the infantry company commanders as their complete guide to the island because they had no idea what was going on at all, coming on a short tour from Germany, which they were all based in.
God, yeah.
So it was a happy year. And
what you were saying, the names you mentioned earlier on, it's quite a strong team. I mean,
yeah, we had
a very strong team. I mean, I think every name you mentioned
the quality
went forward to
indeed.
as Major Generals eventually. So very strong team. Right.
And Sergeant Major Cook and I were invited by Henry Woods came over to stay with Imogen, and our girls teased Imogen enormously because he kept saying there's no fresh milk in Benghazi, you know. But Henry was a huge support, and Sergeant Major Cook and I went over with the RAF, and we landed at El Aden, big RAF base, and the aircraft stopped, and everybody, all these senior RAF officers were told to sit tight. Well, Sergeant Major Cook and I got out of the aircraft and stepped straight into a Skins helicopter driven by Walter Courage with another one driven by Sergeant Stafford beside him, and it was immaculate. And we were whisked off to Benghazi.
I'd love to have seen that.
Yeah,
I bet the RAF didn't.
They were pissed off.
Yes.
So that was a happy year.
Right. And you mentioned briefly that you then went on to be brigade major at 7.
Yes,
Army Brigade.
well, I went there, you see, and took over from Anthony Millen, another skin, and we swapped. He went to command A Squadron in Cyprus, and Richard Keatley had come over in the interim and just from Benghazi to look after the squadron while we were handing over in Germany. And then I had 2 years in Germany with 7 Brigade, Crack Brigade and all the rest of it, 2 brigadiers, Dick Worsley and then Robert Ford. And lovely regiments. The 11th Hussars was still a regiment. 2nd Royal Tank Regiment, very good. And then a Green Jacket Battalion down in Cedar, who'd just been the Rifle Brigade. They became the 3rd Battalion of the Green Jackets.
Yeah.
And
so after that, I mean, you then reached that point in life where promotion was clearly in sight. When did you learn that you were going to become the commanding officer of the 9th 12th Royal Lancers?
Well, it came as a shock, I think, in the Skins, and it's Andy Evans or somebody talks about the Great Five, as if we were Great Five. But unusually for one regiment, 5 of us were on the, whatever list they call it, blue or pink or something, Lieutenant Colonel's list in 69. Charles Taylor, Senior 1, Alan Findlay, David Rurt, Anthony Millen and I. And Charles got the regiment. Alan went to the Northern Yeomanry, Queen's Own Yeomanry. David Rurt to the Royal Yeomanry, South. And Anthony Millen to the Hong Kong Regiment. And I think I was very lucky in that Gilbert Monckton knew me from Cyprus, from Korea. And he had been blocked in the regiment and had commanded the 12th Lancers. And at that time he was colonel of the 9th 12th Lancers and may have put in a good word for me because I went to the 9th 12th. And we went with some trepidation because we'd known both the 9th and the 12th well. And they were all rather wealthy regiments as far as officers' messes were concerned. And we hadn't got a bean between us. But though when you go to another regiment, you perhaps feel a bit like something the cats brought in. It all worked very well. They were hugely welcoming, and it was a very happy time. And it's Catterick to begin with, and then we took the regiment out to Detmold, and Catterick, of course, we were training with one squadron in Berlin, which sort of kept the boys up with their tanks. The young subalterns, we tried to get to Berlin, while the rest of us were training RAC recruits. That was a heartwarming thing. You'd see a lot of scruffy boys coming in, and in a very short time they were on parade, and their mothers would come and say, "Don't know what you've done to our Charlie, but he's a different chap altogether."
He'll never be the same, yeah. Right.
So I enjoyed that very much.
But the regiments, not want to fall into the trap of doing a comparison between regiments, but from a cultural point of view, what were the differences between the Skins and the 9th, 12th Lancers, if any?
I think they both, if they were looking backwards, look forward to high achievements. I mean, one is bound to think a person of my age, you always, I've always looked back to the Second World War heroes, because I was at school in the Second World War and didn't get called up till I was 18. But the 9th and the 12th had both distinguished themselves in the Western Desert and up Italy, but they'd both been ridiculously, the 12th had covered the British expeditionary force back to Dunkirk, and the Commander-in-Chief then said, had it not been for the 12th, the British expeditionary force wouldn't have gone back through Dunkirk. And the poor old 9th was sent by Churchill, after Dunkirk, right up to the front line to fight a desperate rearguard battle in France to escape from the Brittany ports. Extraordinary thing to do, under command of Addenbrooke, who was sent just as a gesture to help the French, although things were obviously lost. So both the 9th and the 12th had been in France engaged, and then were together in North Africa. The 9th is an armoured regiment, and the 12th is a very distinguished armoured car regiment.
Right.
So there was that great spirit, but the Skins look back with the same history of distinguished service before Dunkirk. A bit of a wait then, but then the whole, D plus whatever, right through to Schleswig-Holstein. And I think the sporting scene, officer and other rank, very similar aims and objectives and achievements in the past.
Right, yes. Well,
one felt at home.
That's the key thing, isn't it? Yeah. Right. Well, thank you very much for that. And of course, then there comes that time when, post command, you then disappear into the wider army, doing different jobs. And I believe after commanding the 9th, 12th Royal Lancers, you went to Camberley on the directing staff.
I went to a member of the directing staff. I'd never been very good at all these sort of movement tables and problems that they solve early on in the course, and I struggled. But the nice thing about it is that in syndicates I had, there were hugely supportive students, and if I was modelled, they'd help me through. And the privilege of being on the directing staff at Sandhurst, at Camberley at that time, was that you were with the brightest people in the army and with the others who came from the Royal Navy, the Royal Marines and the Air Force and the overseas students. And I really enjoyed that. And one felt that one was working in an internationally highly sophisticated military academy. And what I fear for terribly in the modern army is that services were so small that we will lose this clout we had on the world scene, because the Americans, they liked sending people to our staff college, and so did every other country in the world. And there was a great Commonwealth feeling there too.
Right, yes.
And I did a year and a bit there, and I was lucky enough to get my promotion to full colonel came through on the list, and then they made me, as it were, a housemaster, one of the 3 divisional commanders at Camberley for a year, and then one was, a full colonel and in charge of a division, and that again was fine and very interesting.
Like that, yes. What about the foreign students? Were there any foreign students during your time who went on to greater things?
Yes. I'm just trying to think, because later on I went to the College of Defence Studies where we had the German C&C and so on. But Camberley, I can't actually.
That's okay.
I can think of some of the characters.
I was just wondering in case there's somebody like Idi Amin or something to that, but probably not. So after being DS at Camberley, you then moved onwards and upwards.
To my surprise, I was
commander of 11 Brigade.
Went to 11 Brigade in Minden, and that was 2 happy years. The 2 armoured regiments were the 1721st and the 3rd Tanks up in Fellingbostel. 3rd Tanks taken over by the 4th 7th. Again, I was had 4th 7th under command under Tony Mullins, who was an old friend, dead now sadly. And Minden was full of infantry, and to begin with we had a light infantry battalion, the 3rd Battalion of Light Infantry, and the Gloucesters, and later the Cheshires took over from the Gloucesters, and the King's Own Royal Border Regiment was there, who actually belonged to 7 Brigade. But it was a big garrison at Minden, happy time, many friends, particularly the Brigade Padre, who we had a tragedy later in life, and he both christened and buried our son, which was an emotive business. He was killed in a traffic accident or an accident. And so there we were. Big exercises, interesting visits from politicians, a near disaster when very soon after, this is a reminiscent story. I arrive as brigade commander. Prue comes out a bit later. In 2 weeks' time, there's to be a visit by a Labour politician, Mr. Rogers, who later became one of the Gang of 3, formed the SDLP.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And he was to have a programme. And it was, first of all, he was to come to the headquarters, see the signal squadron. Then he was going to the Cheshires, and then he was going to the Remy workshops. And then he was going to have lunch with 3LI, and the Corps Commander would come to that. And then he would go out and see training on the ranges, all beautifully organised. Everything rehearsed, except for lunch with 3LI. Now, the 3rd Battalion Light Infantry, there were a lot of old bachelors who lived very well. So they were told to lay on lunch for an important person. We started with lobster thermidor and vintage champagne, which I loved. And we hadn't rehearsed it. And I was sitting opposite the corps commander with this Labour chap, Rogers, on my right. And Jackie Harmon, who was a cavalryman and a distinguished wartime soldier, was looking at me as I went. You do not give lobster thermidor to Labour politicians who are looking at the power of BOR. So I nearly got the sack for that.
Blimey.
It was known as the lobster lunch. It was quite funny afterwards.
You have to laugh afterwards, that's the key thing, isn't it? Yeah, dear, oh dear. Oh, God. But what are your views on obviously the huge FTXs that we used to do in Germany? I mean, obviously at the time they were a requirement and very useful in a way, but what was your personal view on the way we conducted the FTXs?
Well, from the bottom upwards, we did train our people very well to be either armoured soldiers or infantry soldiers and all the rest of it. They needed the training. Whether the tactics go on if you're going out, all right, would have put up with a great Russian onslaught when we were heavy outnumbered is another matter. And of course the tactics get changing. And
yes.
At one stage, we all went up to the inner German border, as we called it, and we sat there in a line. And then people invented something called killing zones, where the Russians were supposed to come into a sort of U-shaped thing, and we would hit them by enfilade fire. And then General Nigel Bagnall, ex-4th 7th Dragoon Guards, was appointed corps commander, and he had a much more flexible idea of moving it. But, I mean, on the whole, I think, as long as recruiting held up, which it had its bumps and sometimes regiments and battalions were below strength, I think we put up a fair show of Cold War worrying.
I think so, yeah.
And the liaison with the Bundeswehr was extremely good, and in the higher echelons of Royal Air Force cooperation and so on, that was very good too. Yeah. And I think the British Army of the Rhine really did itself proud.
So after your time as Commander 11th Armoured Brigade, obviously you moved on from there. I believe you went to the RCDS.
I was lucky enough to go to be a student from the Royal College of Defence Studies. 10 Navy, 10 Army, 10 Air Force, Foreign Office, civil servants, and many overseas people. Hugely interesting lecturers. At our it's changed a bit since then, but we were very privileged to have a fairly short working day with a lot of interest, and it was very good getting to know the other services, people who were reckoned to be going on in their service, and the overseas students who came with us. A highlight of the year is the overseas tour, which lasts about 5 weeks, and varied. I wanted to go on the subcontinent of India tour, but because I was armoured, I was directed to go on the Middle East tour, and no regrets. 10 of us went for a week in Israel, starting in Tel Aviv, ending in Jerusalem, going up to the Golan Heights. Then, with a different passport, which was necessary, over the bridge into Jordan, where we were met, saw the Jordanian army. Hussein heard we were there, so he put off an engagement and came to talk to us. And we did some sightseeing to Petra and places where, funny enough, I had been from the Canal Zone earlier, but great welcome from the Jordanian Armed Forces and the Hashemite royal family. Then on to Cairo, military talks, museums, again a thoroughly good week, and then to Saudi Arabia, where we went down to Jeddah slightly more limited tour, but a very good British embassy there who looked after us very well. We went to Riyadh, but it was a slightly limited tour, but again, very interesting to pick up the vibes of the Middle East. So that was a highlight of the RCDS tour. At the end of which, of course, we all waited for our next jobs, and I went off to a job in operational requirements, looking after future tank, armoured vehicles, B vehicles, that's soft skin vehicles, helicopters and infantry weapons, each of which branch had a colonel in charge of it. And we were bringing in the Chieftain tank, which was the main sort of work of the next 2 years. And the Chieftain, of course, was brought into being out of hulks, which were being prepared for the Shah of Iran. The tank was to be called the Shah Iran, and the Shah fell, and these hulks up at Leeds were turned into Challenger, which Challenger 1 had all the faults of a sophisticated vehicle, but I think Challenger 2 has become a good tank. And it was an interesting time dealing with the various weapons that were coming in, and also a very interesting time because we were still with a threat from the Soviet powers, and there were sort of spying stories in the equipment world, and there were the threats of suddenly discovered, or thought anyway, that the Russian anti-tank armaments, missiles, were of better calibre than we thought, which meant that our armoured vehicles were under-armoured, and there was much chitter-chatter and about all that in the various research establishments at Chobham and at FVRD and at Fort Holstead. So I was heavily involved in the sort of equipment world, looking ahead. Never very satisfactory, that life, because you never know.
Yeah, always changing, yeah.
Plans made 10 years ahead will ever come to fruition.
Right.
Luckily, we weren't building aircraft carriers.
Well, yes, let's say it that way, yeah. So did you cover the upgrade of Chieftain when they put the Stillbrew armour pack onto it?
Yes.
That was all part of this.
All the Chobham armour business.
Right,
yes.
Right, yeah. Oh, interesting days. And then I believe you went to Bonn. Is that correct?
Yes, the Joint Services Liaison Organisation in Bonn. We didn't awfully want to go, but it turned out to be a super 2 years. My bosses were the Commander-in-Chief BOR, the Commander-in-Chief RAF Germany, and the British Ambassador, because we were living in Cologne with this strange house in Bonn, which had been requisitioned at the end of the 14-18 war by Haig as his headquarters, and then at the end of the Second World War, our liaison organisation moved in. The only military in the place were myself and my 9th 12th Lancer driver, Corporal Peach. The rest were all German experts, civil servants. Some of them had been in the Control Commission in Germany from 1945, and they knew all about the treaties which had been made with the defeated Germany to enable us to keep forces in their country, in Germany. And we cooperated with the other so-called sending states, who of course were America down in Bavaria in the south, the Dutch, the Belgians, the French, who although they weren't in NATO, still had quite a large brigade group in Baden-Baden, and the Canadians. And it was very interesting and a sort of semi-diplomatic job. We had the CNC BOR was General Mike Gower, Scots Guardsman, and most friendly person. And Jock Kennedy was the airman, and the two of them had been GOC Scotland and Air Commander Scotland together, and they liked each other. And we had two charming British ambassadors, Oliver Wright, very high-powered, who went on to be ambassador in Washington, and then a person called Jock Taylor, who was hugely supportive and friendly to us. So I belonged to both the embassy and the BOR and RAF Germany, and it was great fun.
Fascinating job, yeah.
Great fun.
Indeed.
And went all over Germany. I had a period where my German was supposed to have improved, and indeed I acquired, I'm told, quite a good accent, but my retention and understanding was never very good. But it didn't matter, because every German wanted to speak English, and you'd go off to a Landrat or a Bundes chap, and after a few halting words in German, we were in English straight away.
Yeah. So after that, I mean, that sounds like a wonderful job in 2 years. You then went to I believe, the Defence Intelligence Staff.
Yeah, that was my last job. I was lucky to get a last job, and it was a tri-service job. I took over from a Rear Admiral, was succeeded by an Air Vice Marshal, and I was in the part that at our level we had two bosses above us, but a Rear Admiral who became a great friend was the forward intelligence. He got the daily reports from around the world. I was, my areas of interest were the people who got the intelligence, and that was people you could hardly speak about then, GCHQ, MI5, MI6, and hugely the Americans with satellite photography and all the rest of it. So, and I also had the office in my bailiwick, if you call it that, of the attaché and liaison staff. So I interviewed every one of our attaches going out to a country, and all the foreign attaches came and met me on taking up appointments and leaving. And that meant that Prue and I went to an attaché party every night of the week. You know, you'd be with the Australians one night and the Indonesians the next. It was because there were 250, I think, overseas military diplomats, as they are, in London.
Wow.
From the small to the large, and with some sort of rather tricky ones at that time.
Yes.
To go to China, you were watched a bit.
Well, a good way, a very interesting job to finish off with.
It was a very interesting job, and I travelled to America a lot, and had sort of, well, you know, in those days, it was before the wall came down, used to go and see all the installations we had in places like Berlin and Hong Kong and so on, and they were extensive, and it was very interesting. Just beside Cheltenham and the two services, there were all sorts of other little places that one really rather forgets about now.
And of course that was in, you finished in 90, or you retired in 1985.
55th birthday, get kicked out.
Yeah, I know the feeling. But then, what did you do after that? Or what did you want to do after that?
Well, we got a young son and we wanted to privately educate him, rightly or wrongly. And to have a salary, I was actually offered by the army, taking over from a previous Major General, older than me, as a sort of, it was called Partnership Secretary of a firm called Smith & Williamson, who flourished since in the city world. They weren't in the city, but they were. I had to move the offices for them very soon after I arrived. And they'd grown and grown. and there were 28 partners when I started, and it was growing. And then I did that for about 18 months, and I liked the people. I didn't, frankly, it wasn't quite me, the sort of, they were all experts in either investment management or accountancy. They were a mixed firm of that, long-standing and high reputation, and they've flourished since. But when Big Bang came in the city, they had to stop being a partnership and become a corporate body, and that meant that my job was gone, just like that. And I knew it was going to, I was warned. So they gave me 6 months off, and it was lucky at that time. I'd been offered running the Army's charity, the Army Benevolent Fund. And so after 6 months, we perhaps stupidly moved out of London to Wilcott near Pusey, because it meant I commuted back in, but I didn't have to keep hugely big hours, and there was quite a bit of going around the country to our committees and all the rest of it. Anyway, I think was very lucky with my colleagues and bosses, and one was amongst friends, and the most heartwarming things was regular meetings we had with all the regimental secretaries who we go down to, say, the headquarters down in Exeter, and all the West Country lot would come in, probably people from the old Somerset and Cornwall Light Infantry and Somerset Light Infantry, who, although they'd all been merged, they still have their home headquarters and places, and I found that very stimulating, and got to know all these regimental secretaries quite well. I have a big one in London where all the Hatmen, the Brigadier Guards would come, and other ones up in Scotland where regiments which had been amalgamated years ago would come. The Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders would come, although they'd probably been amalgamated twice over. And all their welfare cases you would find from the Second World War were Londoners who'd been drafted into the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders. But it was a very happy time. I did it for a long time, 10 years.
10 years, yes. Yeah. And during that time, I believe you were also appointed as Colonel of the Regiment for the 9th 12th.
Yeah.
During that period?
Yes, I was, yeah.
So you were doing that?
I did that 5 years and enjoyed that, obviously.
Right.
Regiment were partly in Germany and partly in East Anglia.
In Swanton?
Well,
Morley.
Debden to begin with, and then Swanton Morley.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
And they also invited me to be national chairman of the Limbless Blesma, and I enjoyed that very much. I was paid a salary by the ABF. Blesma became actually there was quite a lot of trickiness about that. Again, national health rules were changing for the disabled. It was before they got the flux of amputees from more recent conflicts, even Bosnia and then Afghanistan and Iraq and Afghanistan brought a lot of amputees in. It's very different now, but it was still quite tricky, and we had some difficult Second World War cases, and it was. And we had, we used to have our annual conference in a terrible hotel in Blackpool, the Norcroft Hotel. And we had a home in Blackpool, a home in Crieff, and it was a worry as to whether they could both go on. But I enjoyed it. I had very nice people working with me.
Okay. And then, of course, you also, if I've got this right, you became the chairman of the British Korean Veterans Association in Swindon.
President. President first of Swindon.
Sorry, yes. Yeah.
And later they asked
the
me to
national
be president of the national one.
Right.
And that's become quite time consuming, shall we say.
I should imagine, yeah.
And it's come to a bit of a climax this last fortnight, where we had the state visit. The memorial the Koreans asked to place in London at their expense came up against all sorts of planning difficulties, but it all came good in the last fortnight with a state visit from the
visit,
president, and that all went.
And I believe you even had to plant a tree as part of
No, I had to help
help plant the tree.
the president cut the turf, not plant a tree,
cut the tree,
for
yes.
where the memorial will be.
Oh, I see. Sorry.
That's
yes.
how it was.
Yeah.
No, there were no tree planting.
Well, General, what can I say? I mean, that's been. Thank you so much for today.
Well,
it's very interesting.
Great meeting you, and I'm most impressed by your career.
Well, I wouldn't say that. But no, it's been a real honour and a pleasure to speak today. And on behalf of the Royal Dragoon Guard Oral History Project, can I thank you very much for taking part.
Thank you.